Case 1. Dorothea Puente. November 1988. Sacramento police thought they were investigating a missing person report. What they found instead was a garden of the dead. 7 bodies buried beneath the manicured lawn of 1426 F Street, where Dorothea Puente had been cashing Social Security checks for corpses. Puente wasn't just a landlord. She was a predator who weaponized kindness. Her Victorian boarding house catered to society's forgotten. Elderly tenants, recovering addicts, the mentally ill. People nobody would miss. She'd greet them with homemade meals and a grandmother's smile, then slowly poison them with prescription cocktails while they slept in rooms that smelled like lavender and death. The routine was surgical. Wait for the check to arrive. Forge the signature. Bury the body. Repeat. For years, she maintained this macabre cycle, her yard becoming a mass grave hidden beneath rose bushes and concrete slabs. Neighbors commented on how green her lawn looked. They didn't know it was fertilized with 9 human beings. Her unraveling began with Alvaro Montoya, a 51-year-old man with schizophrenia who vanished in 1988. His social worker pressed authorities when his checks kept getting cashed, but he never answered the door. When investigators arrived with shovels, Puente stood on her porch in a floral dress, watching them excavate her crimes. She offered them coffee. Think about that for a second. She offered refreshments to detectives digging up her victims. The body count was staggering. Ruth Monroe, Bert Montoya, Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, James Gallup, Vera Martin. All poisoned, all buried, all reduced to Social Security numbers worth more dead than alive. Puente had turned elderly care into a murder-for-profit operation. Her weapon of choice a combination of Dalmane and codeine that stopped hearts without raising suspicion. She fled to Los Angeles during the investigation, caught days later in a cheap motel after being recognized at a bar. In court, she maintained her innocence with the same sweet demeanor she'd used to lure victims. The jury wasn't fooled. In 1993, she received life without parole. But here's what haunts investigators. They only found 7 bodies in that yard. Puente confessed to 9 total victims. 2 remain missing, their graves unknown, their families denied even the closure of a burial site. Somewhere, Dorothea Puente's final secrets are still buried. Case 2. James Earl Pack. July 13, 2023. Biddeford, Maine. A city where violent crime was so rare that residents still left doors unlocked. That illusion shattered the moment James Earl Pack decided unpaid rent was worth more than human life. Derek Thompson, 19, and Olivia Welch, 18, were trying to do something most teenagers can't: live independently. They'd rented an apartment from Pack, a 79-year-old landlord with a .357 Magnum and a philosophy that tenants were beneath him. When they fell behind on rent, most landlords file eviction papers. Pack loaded his gun. The dispute escalated over weeks. Text messages. Threats. Pack growing increasingly agitated that these kids dared occupy his property without paying. On that July evening, he didn't knock on their door to negotiate. He came with execution in mind. Witnesses heard the shots, sharp cracks that echoed through the building. When police arrived, they found both teenagers dead, killed execution style with precision that suggested premeditation, not panic. This wasn't a confrontation gone wrong. This was assassination over a few $100s. Pack's defense tried painting him as a frustrated elderly man pushed too far. But the evidence told a darker story. The .357 Magnum wasn't grabbed in self-defense. It was brought specifically to end lives. The shots weren't fired in fear. They were placed with intent. Derek and Olivia weren't armed. They weren't threatening. They were simply young, broke, and in the wrong apartment at the wrong time. What makes this case particularly chilling is the calculated nature of the violence. Pack had options: legal eviction, civil court, even changing the locks. Instead, he chose permanent removal. He valued property rights over human existence, reducing 2 teenagers to obstacles to be eliminated rather than people to be reasoned with. In November 2023, Pack was convicted of 2 counts of murder. The courtroom heard victim impact statements from families trying to explain the weight of losing children who were just beginning their adult lives. Derek had plans to study mechanics. Olivia worked 2 jobs trying to make rent. Both died because an old man with a gun decided payment disputes warranted capital punishment. James Earl Pack is now serving life in prison, where he'll spend his final years as someone else's problem, no longer a landlord, just another inmate in a system that finally held him accountable for treating human life as disposable property. Case 3. Chad Allen Reed. January 29, 2020. Battle Creek, Michigan. Chad Allen Reed wasn't just collecting rent. He was collecting victims. When police found the bodies of Joseph Soule, 34, and Jacqueline Leopard, 31, hidden inside Reed's pickup truck, they uncovered a landlord who'd turned a housing dispute into a double homicide so brutal it required 3 different methods to complete. Soule and Leopard were tenants in Reed's property, navigating the awkward dynamic of renting from someone who saw them as both income and inconvenience. The relationship soured over money, cleanliness, boundaries, the usual friction points that normal people resolve with lawyers or awkward conversations. Reed chose violence. The murders weren't quick. Reed shot them first, but that wasn't enough. He beat them with blunt force that shattered bones and left investigators struggling to catalog the injuries. Then he strangled them, watching the life drain from people who'd trusted him enough to sign a lease. 3 separate acts of violence against 2 people who couldn't fight back. This wasn't rage. It was overkill, a landlord asserting ultimate dominion over bodies he felt entitled to control. But here's where Reed's arrogance became evidence. Instead of burying them or attempting disposal, he stuffed both corpses into his truck and just drove around. Like they were cargo. Like human beings could be hidden in a vehicle bed indefinitely without consequences. Investigators found them during a welfare check, the smell of decomposition leading them straight to Reed's mobile tomb. The forensic picture painted horror. Gunshot wounds. Blunt force trauma severe enough to fracture skulls. Ligature marks from strangulation. Reed had essentially tortured 2 people to death over what amounted to a landlord-tenant disagreement that should have ended in small claims court, not a morgue. His trial revealed a man who viewed his tenants as property extensions, things he owned, things he could destroy. Prosecutors presented evidence of escalating conflicts, threats Reed had made, his growing obsession with removing Soule and Leopard permanently. The jury deliberated briefly. In a case this clear-cut, where bodies literally rode around in the killer's truck, reasonable doubt didn't exist. Chad Allen Reed received life without parole in 2021. But the question that haunts Battle Creek is timing. How long did he drive around with those bodies? Did he go to the grocery store? Stop for gas? How many people walked past that truck never knowing they were feet away from a crime scene on wheels? Reed's final secret isn't what he did. It's how long he lived normally while death decomposed in his vehicle. Case 4. David Daniel. October 2020. New York City, where COVID-19 had transformed rent disputes into life-or-death struggles. David Daniel, a 28-year-old landlord, decided unpaid rent during a global pandemic justified stabbing 3 people to death in a killing spree that turned a housing crisis into a triple homicide. His girlfriend and 2 tenants. 3 separate human beings reduced to obstacles in Daniel's mind, all eliminated with a knife because checks stopped coming during lockdown. Think about the psychology required to look at people struggling through a pandemic and decide their financial hardship warrants execution. The murders were intimate and brutal. Stabbing requires proximity, effort, commitment. Daniel had to be close enough to see their faces, hear their final words, feel the resistance of flesh and bone. This wasn't distant violence. It was personal annihilation carried out against people who trusted him enough to share living space. Investigators found a scene of absolute carnage. Blood evidence suggesting struggle, desperation, victims trying to escape a landlord who'd transformed from property manager into executioner. The girlfriend likely never saw it coming. Domestic violence masquerading as landlord rage. The tenants died watching someone they paid for shelter become the person who ended their lives. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the COVID context. Eviction moratoriums existed specifically to prevent housing loss during unprecedented economic collapse. Daniel had legal protections, government programs, options beyond murder. Instead, he chose the knife, deciding that temporary financial loss justified permanent elimination of human beings. The prosecution painted Daniel as a man who valued money over humanity, someone so entitled to rental income that he'd commit triple homicide rather than accept delayed payment. His defense offered no coherent explanation. How could they? 3 people were dead over rent that would eventually have been paid or legally addressed through courts. Daniel was convicted on all counts in 2022, sentenced to life without possibility of parole. He'll spend decades in a cell smaller than the apartments he once rented out, his own freedom permanently revoked for revoking others' lives. But here's what keeps investigators up at night: the premeditation. Daniel didn't snap, he planned. He armed himself, waited for opportunity, executed 3 people systematically. Somewhere in his mind, he'd already decided his tenants were disposable long before the pandemic gave him an excuse to act on that belief. Case 5. Gerald Brekka. March 20th, 2022. Hamilton, Montana. Gerald Brekka owned rental property on South 2nd Street, and when his tenants, an engaged couple, decided to leave his moldy basement apartment, he made sure they'd never make it out alive. The couple had every right to flee. The basement unit was uninhabitable, walls blooming with black mold that threatened their health with every breath. They'd complained, documented, pleaded for basic repairs. Brekka ignored them, so they packed their belongings and headed for the door, believing the worst part of renting from him was behind them. They were catastrophically wrong. Brekka was waiting. As they carried boxes up the stairs toward freedom, he opened fire. Gunshots echoed through the residential neighborhood. Not warning shots, not intimidation, but calculated attempts to kill 2 people whose only crime was wanting to breathe clean air. The couple ran, desperate, realizing their landlord had become their executioner over a security deposit and hurt pride. They made it outside. Barely. Bleeding, terrified. They fled while Brekka transformed his property into a fortress. When police arrived, they found him barricaded inside with 5 firearms, a small arsenal he'd apparently been stockpiling for exactly this kind of confrontation. Think about that. A landlord so unhinged he maintained multiple weapons specifically to punish tenants who dared leave. The standoff lasted hours. Negotiators tried reasoning with a man who'd already demonstrated reason had left the building. Brekka, holed up inside the same moldy property he'd refused to fix, surrounded by guns, convinced he was the victim in a situation where he'd literally shot 2 people from moving out. Eventually, tactical teams extracted him. The couple survived, but with permanent psychological scars and physical injuries that required extensive medical treatment. They'd entered that basement apartment seeking affordable housing and left as attempted murder survivors, their engagement overshadowed by trauma inflicted by a landlord who valued control over human life. Brekka's trial revealed a pattern of tenant intimidation, complaints ignored, repairs weaponized as bargaining chips. But shooting fleeing tenants crossed from negligent landlord into domestic terrorist. Prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation. Those 5 firearms didn't appear overnight. Brekka had been preparing for violent confrontation, waiting for tenants to challenge his authority. He was convicted of attempted murder in 2023, sentenced to decades in prison. But the bigger question remains unanswered. How many other tenants had Brekka threatened? How many left quietly, terrified, never reporting abuse because they feared exactly what this couple experienced? The engaged couple eventually married, but their wedding was marked by survivors' guilt and PTSD. They'd wanted better living conditions. They nearly died for it. And somewhere in Montana's prison system, Gerald Brekka sits in a cell far cleaner than the moldy basement he shot people for abandoning. Case 6. Stanley Jensen. February 8, 2021. Largo, Florida. Stanley Jensen had a rental property and a tenant named Mark Bruss who was behind on rent. Most landlords file eviction paperwork. Jensen grabbed a gun and shot Bruss 6 times in the back, turning a civil dispute into cold-blooded execution. Bruss wasn't armed. He wasn't threatening. He was literally walking away when Jensen opened fire, bullets tearing through his back in rapid succession. 6 shots, 6 deliberate pulls of the trigger, 6 opportunities for Jensen to stop and choose differently. He chose murder every single time. The shooting happened during an improper eviction attempt. Jensen hadn't gone through legal channels, hadn't obtained court orders, hadn't followed any of the procedures designed to protect both landlords and tenants. Instead, he'd shown up personally to force Bruss out, and when the confrontation didn't go his way, he executed a man over rental income. 6 shots. In the back. Let that sink in. Bruss was facing away, retreating, posing zero threat. Jensen still fired repeatedly, ensuring death rather than injury, completion rather than warning. This wasn't self-defense gone wrong. It was assassination disguised as a landlord dispute. Witnesses heard the gunfire and called 911, but by the time paramedics arrived, Mark Bruss was already gone. He died on property he'd been renting, killed by the person who'd promised him shelter in exchange for monthly payments. The irony is suffocating. Housing is supposed to provide safety, not become your murder scene. Jensen's defense tried claiming he felt threatened, that Bruss had been aggressive, that fear justified 6 bullets in a retreating man's back. But forensic evidence demolished that narrative. The bullet trajectories, the spacing of wounds, the lack of any weapon on Bruss, everything pointed to execution, not self-defense. Prosecutors painted Jensen as a landlord who'd grown so entitled to rental income that he viewed non-payment as a capital offense. He'd skipped legal eviction because courts take time, cost money, require patience. A gun was faster, permanent, and in Jensen's warped calculation, justified. The jury disagreed. In 2022, Stanley Jensen was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He'll never collect rent again, never own property again, never have the freedom he stole from Mark Bruss over a few $100s in unpaid housing costs. But here's what haunts Bruss's family, the senselessness. Mark was trying to leave, trying to de-escalate, literally turning his back to walk away. And that's when Jensen decided to shoot. 6 times. The last thing Mark Bruss saw wasn't his killer's face. It was the path away from danger, a path that should have led to safety, but instead led to death. Case 7. Javier Ortoll. August 23, 2018. Naples, Florida. Javier Ortoll was 79 years old, a landlord who'd spent decades collecting rent and nursing grievances. When his tenant Edward Maloney fell behind on payments, Ortoll decided his golden years would include murder. Maloney, 56, was struggling financially, a reality millions of renters face without ending up dead. He'd fallen behind, yes, but he was communicating, trying to work something out, operating under the naive assumption that his elderly landlord valued human life over a security deposit. That assumption cost him everything. The confrontation happened at the rental property, a face-to-face meeting that should have ended with payment plans or eviction notices. Instead, Ortoll brought a gun. At 79, he'd lived through wars, recessions, countless societal changes, and somehow concluded that unpaid rent in retirement justified ending another person's existence. He shot Maloney dead. One bullet, one decision, one moment where a senior citizen chose homicide over the phone call to an attorney that would have resolved everything legally. Maloney collapsed, his life bleeding out over money he probably would have eventually paid or been legally evicted for owing. Ortoll's defense was predictable, self-defense. He claimed Maloney had been aggressive, threatening, dangerous. But here's the problem with that narrative. Ortoll was 79 years old and had deliberately brought a firearm to a rent dispute. You don't arm yourself for a conversation unless you've already decided violence is an option. Self-defense requires imminent danger, not premeditated confrontation. The prosecution dismantled his story methodically. Witnesses testified about Ortoll's escalating anger over the unpaid rent, his threats, his obsession with collecting what he felt entitled to. Forensic evidence showed Maloney hadn't been armed, hadn't been positioned aggressively, hadn't done anything except exist in debt to a man who decided creditors have execution rights. Think about the calculation in Ortoll's mind. He was nearly 80, statistically closer to death than most people in that courtroom. He could have spent his final years peacefully, written off the debt, moved on. Instead, he chose to become a murderer, to spend whatever time he had left branded as someone who killed over rental income. The jury rejected his self-defense claim in 2019. They saw through the Elderly Victim Act, recognizing that age doesn't excuse murder, that being a senior citizen doesn't grant immunity for shooting tenants. Ortoll was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison, time he likely won't survive given his age. Edward Maloney's family watched a 79-year-old man get sentenced, knowing their loved one died over an amount of money that could have been resolved in small claims court. They'll never get him back. And Ortoll will die in prison, his legacy not as a landlord or retiree, but as a murderer who valued dollars over human dignity. Case 8. Pamela Merritt. April 2021. Houston, Texas. Pamela Merritt didn't just kill her landlord Colin Cardaci. She became him, assuming his identity in a scheme so disturbing it sounds like horror fiction. But the blood soaking into his carpet was terrifyingly real. Cardaci was 64, a landlord who'd rented property to Merritt, probably never imagining his tenant was capable of murder, identity theft, and psychological manipulation sophisticated enough to fool investigators. He collected rent, maintained properties, lived a quiet life. Then Pamela Merritt decided he was more valuable dead than alive. She killed him in his own home, stabbed him repeatedly, turning his living room into an abattoir. But murder was just the beginning. While Cardaci's body was still warm, Merritt began the transformation, assuming his identity like a snake shedding skin. She accessed his accounts, his documents, his entire existence, erasing Colin Cardaci the person and replacing him with Colin Cardaci the puppet she controlled. Then came the truly diabolical part. She convinced another tenant to help clean up the crime scene. Think about the manipulation required, persuading someone to scrub blood evidence, to participate in covering up murder, all while pretending to be the victim she'd just killed. This wasn't impulsive violence. This was calculated psychological warfare. The tenant cleaned, probably terrified, possibly confused, definitely traumatized by discovering they'd been aiding a murderer. They wiped away blood, disposed of evidence, sanitized a killing floor while Merritt orchestrated everything, wearing Cardaci's identity like a costume. But corpses don't stay hidden forever, and identities don't transfer cleanly. Investigators started noticing inconsistencies, Cardaci's accounts being accessed strangely, his communications sounding off, his absence from places he should have been. They dug deeper and found Pamela Merritt pulling strings behind a dead man's name. When they finally searched the property, they found evidence Merritt's cleaning crew had missed. Blood spatter that told stories of violence, forensic markers that screamed murder, DNA that connected Merritt to Cardaci's death in ways no amount of scrubbing could erase. The prosecution presented a case of premeditated murder followed by identity fraud, two separate crimes that together painted Merritt as someone who saw her landlord not as a person, but as an asset to be liquidated and exploited. She'd killed him for access to his life, his money, his identity. Merritt was convicted in 2023, sentenced to life in prison. She'll never assume another identity, never manipulate another tenant, never kill another landlord. But the tenant she tricked into cleaning still lives with the psychological horror of unknowingly destroying evidence of murder, of being used as a tool in someone else's homicidal scheme. Colin Cardaci's family mourns a man who was erased twice, first by murder, then by identity theft. His name lived on after his death, but controlled by his killer, used to hide the very crime that ended him. Case 9. Shelly Harmon. September 1988. Prescott, Arizona. Pamela Pitts was a tenant behind on rent, and her landlord Shelly Harmon decided late payment deserved a death sentence. But this wasn't a quick execution. This was prolonged brutality that ended with fire and a secret Harmon kept buried for 3 decades. Pitts was 19 years old, barely an adult, trying to navigate independent living in an economy that made rent a constant struggle. She'd fallen behind on payments to Harmon, who didn't see a teenager in financial distress. She saw an inconvenience that needed permanent elimination. Harmon beat her to death. Not a single blow, not a moment of rage, sustained, brutal violence that shattered bones and destroyed tissue. Pitts tried to defend herself, tried to escape, tried to survive an assault from someone who was supposed to provide shelter, not slaughter. She died slowly, painfully, at the hands of a landlord who'd transformed from property manager into executioner. But Harmon wasn't finished. A body creates questions, attracts investigators, demands answers. So she burned Pamela Pitts, reducing a 19-year-old woman to ashes and bone fragments, erasing her physical existence like she'd never mattered at all. The fire consumed evidence, consumed identity, consumed everything except the guilt that would eventually consume Harmon herself. For 30 years, Shelly Harmon lived free. She collected rent from other tenants, maintained properties, walked through Prescott like a normal landlord instead of someone who'd beaten a teenager to death over housing payments. Pamela Pitts became a cold case, a missing person, a name in a file that gathered dust while her killers slept soundly. But secrets have weight, and 3 decades of carrying murder eventually crushed Harmon's silence. In 2018, she confessed. 30 years later, she finally admitted to beating Pamela Pitts to death, to burning her body, to living free while a family spent decades wondering what happened to their daughter. Think about that timeline, 1988 to 2018. 30 years of holidays Pitts never celebrated, birthdays never acknowledged, a life never lived beyond 19 because a landlord decided rent was worth more than human existence. Harmon experienced 3 decades of freedom that her victim never got. Adulthood, relationships, careers, experiences all denied to Pamela Pitts. The confession detailed brutality that still haunts investigators. Harmon described the beating with disturbing clarity, remembered the fire, recalled disposing of remains like they were trash. She'd lived with these memories for 30 years, compartmentalizing murder while functioning in society. Harmon was arrested and convicted in 2021, sentenced to life in prison at 50 years old. She'd spent more years free after the murder than Pamela Pitts spent alive. The mathematics of injustice don't balance. 19 years of life erased, 30 years of freedom granted to the killer. Pitts's family finally got answers, but answers don't resurrect the dead. They buried fragments, whatever remained after fire in 3 decades, knowing their daughter died over rent money that seems impossibly trivial compared to the life stolen. The question that haunts Prescott: what finally broke Harmon's silence? Guilt? Fear of deathbed secrets? The unbearable weight of walking past Pitts's missing person posters for 30 years? We'll never fully know what triggered the confession, only that it came 3 decades too late for justice to feel anything except hollow. Case 10. Arthur Raffy Aslanian. August 2021. Los Angeles, California. Arthur Raffy Aslanian owned an apartment building in one of America's most expensive housing markets, and he decided his low-income tenants were obstacles to profit margins worth eliminating, literally. So he hired a hitman and plotted arson in a scheme that treated human lives as acceptable collateral damage for real estate development. Aslanian wasn't a street-level criminal driven by desperation. He was a property owner who'd done the math and concluded that murdering tenants and burning buildings was more profitable than legal eviction. Let that calculation sink in. He weighed human lives against rental income and decided fire was the better investment. The hitman plot came first. Aslanian approached someone willing to kill for money, offering payment to eliminate specific tenants who were protected by rent control laws. These weren't dangerous criminals or threats. They were low-income residents legally occupying apartments Aslanian wanted emptied for higher-paying renters. His solution wasn't patience or legal maneuvering. It was contract killing. But murder for hire wasn't enough. Aslanian also plotted arson, planning to burn the entire building with tenants potentially still inside. Fire would erase evidence, void leases, create insurance opportunities, and permanently remove the low-income occupants, preventing him from maximizing property value. In his mind, a building full of people became a building full of profits waiting to be unlocked through flames. Think about the sociopathy required. Aslanian sat in planning meetings, discussed logistics, arranged payments for murder and arson while his tenants paid rent below him, completely unaware their landlord was orchestrating their deaths. They trusted him with their housing, their safety, their lives, and he was literally pricing out their assassinations. The scheme unraveled when the hitman turned informant. Undercover operations captured Aslanian discussing murder and arson with chilling casualness, treating human elimination like a business transaction. Recordings revealed a landlord who'd completely dehumanized his tenants, reducing them to financial obstacles requiring violent removal. FBI agents arrested Aslanian before he could execute the plan, but the charges painted a horrifying picture. Conspiracy to commit murder, arson conspiracy, plotting to kill multiple people for real estate profit. This wasn't a landlord snapping under stress. This was premeditated, calculated, business-minded murder planned with spreadsheet precision. His trial in 2023 exposed the darkness lurking in Los Angeles' housing crisis. Prosecutors presented evidence of Aslanian's financial motivations, the profit margins he'd calculated, the increased rental income he'd projected after eliminating low-income tenants. He'd literally budgeted for murder. Aslanian was convicted on all counts, sentenced to decades in federal prison. His tenants, the ones he plotted to kill, still live in that building, now managed by someone who doesn't view them as combustible obstacles. They survive because a hitman grew a conscience, because investigators acted quickly, because luck intervened where their landlord's humanity failed. But here's what terrifies housing advocates. Aslanian got caught. How many other landlords have made similar calculations and succeeded? How many fires were actually arson? How many deaths were actually murder disguised as accidents? The questions linger like smoke.